PayPal, we go beyond the button to help you attract, convert, and retain more customers. Discover how your business can do more with PayPal.
Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to BoF Live. Thank you very much for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about securing a senior role in fashion. I think it's apparent to all of us that over the last few years, there has been a shift in expectations placed on senior leaders who are now expected to have adapted to the challenge of leading remote teams, evolving management at an organizational level to evolve from command-style hierarchies to coach-style development, whilst rationalizing asynchronous methods of communication and responding to increased burnouts during lockdowns, all the while accommodating multiple generational workforces with often arguably quite distinct working styles, which may even be somewhat contradictory at points. Indeed, today, employees are looking for leaders to take a stance on societal issues, with 61% of workers choosing their employees based on their beliefs and values. And what's more, the pressure is not only coming from the inside of companies. Externally, geopolitical disruption and indeed the politicization of capitalism, as well as the need to address bias and systemic racism, as well as adopting and investing in new technology and dealing with data breaches and whole new areas of ethical concern, means that the task set ahead of senior leaders today is ever more complex. I'm delighted, in order to discuss this fascinating subject, to be joined by Muriel Wilkins. Muriel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Muriel is the managing partner and co-founder of Paravis Partners and is a C-suite advisor and executive coach with a nearly 20-year track record of helping senior leaders take their effectiveness to the next level. She is the host of the Harvard Business Review's podcast, Coaching Real Leaders, and the co-author of Own the Room, Discover Your Signature Voice to Master Your Leadership Presence. And she's served senior clients across a really wide range and gamut of industries, but also including luxury consumer goods and retail. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a business undergraduate degree from Georgetown University. Again, Muriel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Just before we kick off, just a small bit of housekeeping. Please do feel free to answer questions in the chat box. We will get to as many as we can. We will leave a little bit of time at the end of the talk to answer any remaining questions. But with that all said, Muriel, to kick things off, as I've just mentioned, the expectations on leaders today have really shifted. And how do you see that evolving? And what do you think that's meant to what it means today to prepare yourself to be a senior leader?
So, Robin, the first thing is being aware of how things are changing. I think that, what you summarized in the intro in terms of the external factors and what's happening and what the expectations are of leaders today is critical, right? In terms of people understanding that that's what's happening. So I think in terms of preparing for leadership, you have to understand what your current role is, but you have to also be planning for the future. And what that means is not just performing and, as we say,
I'm so sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Muriel is actually experiencing some adverse weather conditions. Her internet is, we believe, going to be strong enough to hold the conversation, okay. But it may just be slightly patchy at points. But we did have a 20-minute chat prior where it wasn't interrupted, so we think it's going to be good enough. But Muriel, please do carry on. Don't worry.
Oh, so sorry. So am I back now?
You're back.
Okay, terrific. So I'm just going to try to re-summarize what I said. I think it's really critical that people who are aspiring for senior leadership in the future really focus on understanding what is expected of leaders, not just today, but start understanding what will be expected of them in the future, right? So if you think down the line, 5 years, 10 years from now, whatever your path is, to start thinking about what are the things that are going to be required of me so that I can start demonstrating those skills while still performing the role that I'm in today, right? So I always tell my clients, don't just focus on the future and lose sight of what's happening now, but also don't just focus on what's happening now and lose sight of what's going to be required on the future. You really want to be straddling both at the same time.
When we think about those skills that you think are particularly relevant, and obviously, part of what typifies the market today is the rate of change, the amount of disruption. But are there any, perhaps we could start with hard skills, but are there any hard skills that you still see as fundamental to, declaring yourself to be a viable leadership candidate? And perhaps afterwards we can talk about soft skills quickly.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think particularly when you're looking to rise into a senior role, there are definitely some fundamental hard skills that you need to be aware of. Because when you are rising to a more senior role, you're no longer positioning yourself as a functional expertise or an expert in your domain. You're really becoming a business leader or an organizational leader. So what's required there from a hard skill standpoint? An ability to think strategically, and just pure strategic planning skills, right? Business acumen skills. So there are a lot of individuals who have a career path, do really well in their job, but don't have the fundamental business acumen, financial acumen skills that it takes to run an organization. Not even knowing how to read a balance sheet, right? So at the very least, I think those two things, the ability to understand what it means to set a strategy and then direct a strategy and plan around that, as well as just pure business financial acumen that you need to understand to be able to run any type of business that's in the business of making a profit.
I think we've seen a revolution in the accessibility of some educational courses that previously, were limited to MBA, extremely competitive MBAs. Is there value in individuals going out and seeking independent organizations that can give them some of those skills? Are there any that you'd recommend, or are there any pitfalls that you might warn against? Because, there are also a number of business organizations that perhaps don't, deserve the credentials that they pretend to have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there are none specifically that I would recommend in terms of, beyond sort of the common cast of characters of the ones who do have, great business educations like Harvard or Wharton or London's Business School of Economics, those types of schools. But I think once you've reached a certain point of your career, it isn't always necessary that you do go back and get your MBA. You might need some very specialized education, and then you look at it more in the form of executive education. I think it's really about making the bridge between your practical experience and that business knowledge, so that it creates a very good foundation for you to be able to lead at the next level. So I do think it is worthwhile. That said, let me caveat that by saying some people, I see a lot of individuals who sort of use the lack of education as an excuse, and then are in this constant state of just getting the next degree or the next course or the next, certification. And at some point, you just have to say, okay, you've learned enough. Now you've actually got to go out and try it, right? And then the other thing I would say is beyond education, and this is not, a plug in any way, but I think this is where executive coaching does come into play as well. It sort of is the difference between going to a group training session at the gym to getting a personal trainer. So being able to leverage that type of support or any type of leadership development or business development information that you're able to get from your organization, take advantage of those types of things.
And I assume, just before we move on to soft skills, that the real skill here is being able to tailor your current activities, your current role, to somehow act as some kind of evidentiary support, that you are thinking strategically, that you are directing strategies from start to finish, that you are processing profit and balance sheets. Are there any, what about that area where you're using your current role, or where you're showing your skills, those skills you already possess? Are there any tips that you might share?
I mean, Robin, I really think it is about your ability to speak two languages, right? So given that at the end of the day, it's going to probably be people who are more senior than you, who are going to give you the opportunity to advance to that next level, whatever that might be, you've got to be able to speak their language. And I think one of the challenges that people have is they've grown up really being rewarded for the success that they've had in their particular role, right? And when I think about when I first came out of college and my first job was in strategic planning, well, that's the only language I spoke. But then when I wanted to get into a marketing role and rise more senior, the more senior I became, the more I needed to think about the business comprehensively rather than just my little silo. So I needed to do both. And so in a practical terms, what that means is when I communicated, or when you communicate with people more senior than you, can you communicate in a way that ties what you're doing to the bigger picture of what's happening from the business? Can you ask questions that reflect that you have the knowledge and perspective of the broader business, of the industry, right? Again, over and beyond the silo and the role that you sit in.
That segues perfectly to my next question, which is about communicating with leaders. I think we've seen there is very urgent change that needs to happen at a leadership level globally in terms of diversifying leadership, in terms of being more inclusive. And as a result, you do feel that there is a changing of the guard, that there is now an openness to the guard being changed. However, as you say, the people that are often at the head of these recruitment committees are the old guard. What advice do you have in terms of, and I don't want to fall into generational cliches, but what advice would you have in communicating, leaders that are obviously open to change to some degree, but being that comfortable, middle ground where you are both representing the change that has to happen, but communicating it in a way that they can receive it?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of those leaders that you're talking about who are the old guard, whatever, they're my clients, right? So I get, the struggle. And I think what I'm seeing is that for quite a while now, it's been sort of this pull on both ends where it's like, the younger generation is saying, no, you need to listen to us and how what we're thinking. And the older generation is saying, well, no, this is how I got here, so you need to do it the same way. And what I would say to the folks, here today, as well as to my own clients who are that older guard, is that there's a middle ground, right? Your message is not that different, but can you frame your message in a way that's relevant to that stakeholder? So if it's a younger, somebody who's more junior in their career, who's looking to position themselves and looking to communicate with those who are more senior, who are from a different perspective, different generation, but are starting to be more open, your job is to try to make the bridge. How do you frame the opportunities that you see? How do you frame the issues that you see? How do you frame the expectations that you have in a way that is relevant to them, right? It doesn't mean that you give up your agenda. You're just positioning it in a way that's really going to increase the probability of your message landing in a way that best supports you. So from a communication skills standpoint, this is not revolutionary. This is nothing new. This is the great skill of being able to influence and frame. But I think what we've seen over the past couple of years is that folks are just having the expectation that others should understand what they want, what they need, where they want to go, rather than saying, okay, my only expectation is that they listen to me, but now let me try to language it in a way that makes it relevant and that gets them to have more vested interest in what I'm trying to do.
Something that I've experienced in my career, though not internally, but dealing with leaders, you often have shorter amounts of time. They are very, very good at getting to an incisive point, and it's a challenge at times to have the requisite time. And we've had a question from one of our community members about the best way to showcase your portfolio of experience, the best way to what advice you would have. And I certainly had to learn the lesson that they don't need to know everything. What I saw relevant to my development is actually, I was a barrister 50 years ago. It's utterly irrelevant, very relevant to me, utterly irrelevant to future employment. What advice would you have about those almost elevator pitch moments that you may only have with your CEO once in a while?
That's right. So, the place to, what you just said around, they don't need to know everything is absolutely true, right? And that is like the golden rule. So the first thing you have to think about is what's important to them. What do they care about? And what they typically care about are outcomes and results. What I see many people do, and it's the biggest error, is when they have that moment where literally they're in the elevator or they're on Zoom these days, and it's like, hey, how you doing? What's going on? What they respond with is their laundry list of all their to-dos, right? Everything that they've done, but they do not do a good job of articulating what's the result, what's the outcome, or what's the key issue, and then filtering that down to the outcomes, the results, and the key issues that particular leader actually cares about, right? You have to think about it in terms every time you're in the front of somebody senior, whether it's a client or whether it's somebody internal, they're clocking, what is your billable hour, which is another way of saying, what's the value that you're bringing to the table? And so you want to be able to articulate that value. How do you articulate it? You articulate it through results and outcomes. not only what you're working on, but how is it adding value to that leader or to the company or the organization or the team.
One of the other shifts we've seen in sort of the makeup of leadership boards is, in addition to who the individuals are, it is the expertise they bring to the table. And, just thinking about digital communications, marketing, clearly this has gone from a siloed afterthought to almost the entire strategy of many consumer facing companies going through this shop front. How, in that circumstance where you are both only telling them what they need to know, and you've created this inspirational sort of, summation of your impact in the industry. What in your experience of when you've been coaching your clients, how have they best managed to express and explain potentially new parts of the business or potentially new considerations? The metaverse is clearly something that any major digital facing business should be considering. It's probably the last thing that an old guard leader is going to understand beyond digital avatars being a bit pointless.
Right. So I think the best way to do that is you have to think about what's the problem that you're trying to solve. Folks typically come out the gates with, hey, I have an idea, right? Or I have a solution, or I have a project, or I have something innovative that we ought to be thinking about, without teeing up, what's the problem? If somebody doesn't realize that there's actually a problem, why should they listen to the solution that you're then presenting? So in terms of framing any pitch that you're trying to make, whether it's a little pitch or a big pitch in terms of a vision or a new business, it's no different than marketing, right? What's the customer need? And if the customer doesn't know what the need is, then you have to sort of surface, like, you've been in those shoes where you realize, wow, I didn't know I needed that. I did not know that was a problem in my life. And next thing you know, you're clicking and ordering it, right? And so it's the same thing from a business standpoint. If you want to pitch an idea or want the organization to go in a different path, or you've got to make the business case, and you start the business case with, here's the problem, here's the complication that it creates, here's the question that it then surfaces, and oh, by the way, I have the answer, right? And here's my answer. And if we follow through on this answer, here's where I think it's going to get us in terms of future state. So it's a very structured approach to doing that. And it doesn't take a long time, but you have to do the work to kind of get clarity around that message.
Just before we move on from hard skills to some of sort of the softer skills, although obviously communication falls across both, how would you advise individuals to interact with development opportunities internally? There's an increasing desire for companies to increase retention, to really try and develop their employees and give them that opportunity to create these skills within an organization. But it can be a minefield, it is complex, and it may well not be sufficient to give them the real skills that they need. How would you suggest people interact with internal development opportunities?
Sure. So I think rule of thumb is be open to them, right? I see too many people who close the door before they've actually entertained. So it doesn't mean you need to take them all. And by the way, if you have an abundance of development opportunities, consider yourself very grateful, because that's not the case for many. So you definitely want to be opportunistic and take a look at them. And then you want to vet from the standpoint of what is it exactly that you're going to be gaining from that opportunity. And where there tends to be a disconnect is that folks tend to rule out opportunities that are not automatically going to lead to a promotion. Let me say this. Development is not just about promotion. That is like the biggest fallacy around. If you only see your development as promotion and as this linear progression, you're going to be very disappointed along your career. It's just like anything else in life, right? Progression is not linear. It's the zigzag. It's up and down and sideways across. So, but what you want to be aware of is what's the learning that's going to happen at every point, and be very clear about what you're going to be getting out of that opportunity. Is it visibility to new people? Is it actually learning of a skill? Is it exposure to a different side of the business? And how does that put you on a step closer to what you might want to have down the line, right? The other thing I would say is when you consider development opportunities, particularly if they're assignments, like temporary assignments, be clear about what the exit is. what are the options that are going to be ahead of you after you leave this? What does it lead to next, right? Doesn't mean that it's a guarantee, but at least be clear about what those things might be, have conversations about them so that you know what you might be coming back to, right? I had a client who had an opportunity once to leave the headquarters of his organization, and they were sending him to Japan to help out there. And he was like, why am I going to go to Japan? I don't know. This is where all the top leaders are. Here where I am. Should I leave? And at the end of the day, what he did is, even though that was a 3-year assignment, he accepted based on what they told him probably would happen when he came back, right? So there was then a path forward, and that helped him. He ended up staying there for 10 years, by the way, because it kept growing and growing. So you just never know.
I want to shift now, and I did mention in the introduction this shift from command style hierarchies to coach style development, but actually I want to talk about the difference between leadership and management, because although the management needs of organizations are changing, the expectations of employees have shifted dramatically, leaders typically are not managed, or management is not really the core value that they are bringing to the business. So what about that transition? How do you help people coach through that shift in their mind?
Yeah, I mean, look at it. Look, the way I think about it is management is a position. Leadership is an actual behavior and a way of being, right? So there's a difference. Yes, there are leadership positions, but I see people who are the most junior person in the room, and they show more leadership behaviors and competency than the more senior person, particularly when we get to the soft skills piece. Okay, so management, from my standpoint, is actually a hard skill. It's your ability to plan what needs to happen, to mobilize people to get there, and then to facilitate that process of getting people from point A to point B. All right. That is management. Now, are there certain levers you have to pull to be able to manage effectively? What I call, good management hygiene. Absolutely, right? From a leadership standpoint, there are higher order management skills, such as planning. As I mentioned before, planning becomes strategic thinking and setting strategy. You're leading at a much bigger scale, so managing at a bigger scale. So being able to do that is a very different skill. But there are certain behaviors that are just elevated, right? Your ability to have discernment, your ability to make decisions, your ability to ensure followership at a much larger scale, right? Your ability to not be the one who does the work, but actually mobilizes and inspires and influences others to do the work. The ability to prioritize at a much larger scale. So I think from a leadership standpoint, there's the softer skills, which we'll talk about, but really it's taking the management skills at scale, in addition to being able to understand how the soft skills apply to being able to lead a whole organization.
Let's talk about those soft skills now. We've seen a real change in what it means to go to work today. Purpose is a part of, people want purpose to be a part of their daily life. People are increasingly unwilling to be, in moral compromises with what companies do. They are certainly increasingly uncomfortable with toxic company culture. What are the soft skills that have emerged from that shift in culture that you think are so relevant today?
Yeah, and here's the thing, Robin. Like, I'm really hoping sometime in my lifetime that we'll stop even using the word soft skills, right? Because they're human skills, is what they are. It really is. What people are realizing is, oh, I'm a human being, and I spent an enormous amount of my time at this place, and therefore I would like to be treated like a human being when I'm here, right? This notion of, even before, we used to say work-life balance. And I've always said, why are we separating the two, right? I think about it more as work-life integration. You don't leave who you are when you're outside of work, when you're inside of work. So the soft skills are really human skills. And I think the demand on senior leaders, what I find is that, as I coach them, is they really have to become much more astute and much more knowledgeable about what it means to be a human and what makes humans tick, And at the end of the day, I mean, it's the whole psychology of it, right? At the end of the day, we're all looking for a couple of things, and we've been looking at them since we were, 2 years old. We want to feel worthy. We want to feel valued. We want to feel like we belong. We want to feel understood. And if you provide that to people, whether it's your kids, your spouse, your partner, your friends, your employees, you will get so much more in terms of what they bring to the table. And in this case, work, right? So the soft skills are all to get to that objective. So what are those soft skills? The ability to listen, the ability to engage with people in a way that still respects who they are as a person, the ability to see people, the ability to understand where they're coming from, the ability to show that you care, all while still driving results, right? And that's where people miss the boat. They think they have to do one or the other, and that there's no room to do both.
Absolutely. Providing psychological security, I think, is just such a sensible business decision. It's amazing how much can get lost by the pressure of the workplace.
Some
of those soft skills we were talking about were quite internally focused, but obviously, as we mentioned as well, there are now in certain industries many moments when leaders have to take mea culpa moments, when leaders have to be public facing, when they have to represent or explain things to their organization, even, those uncomfortable points. What's your advice for those? And I want later on to talk a little bit more, very soon, to talk more about the transition period from applicant to leader, across the threshold. But what's your advice for those that are, potentially representing entire companies through challenging circumstances today?
At the end of the day, what I'm finding is that those leaders who have landed in, very tricky situations for them in terms of being able to understand, they're like, why do I have to go say I'm sorry? Like, it's not these are behind the closed doors conversations that I have with them. What they're facing is that the world has become more complex, but they haven't caught up, right? They haven't caught up psychologically, emotionally, mentally, and then skill-wise. And so a large part of where we have to start with, for me, is for them to get to understand that when they go and have to communicate to their organization or externally about what's happened, it's not about them. And so the first place is like, why are you taking it so personally? Right? Like, the minute you accepted this role, you accepted that you represent this organization. You are the organization. This is what people see you as. And so what do you want your organization to stand for? And once they can get off this, like, I'm being attacked, it's all about me, they start realizing there's a bigger purpose here, there's a bigger picture, and it's their ability to hold the both and, right? I stand for what I believe in, and I understand how people feel, and therefore, how do I hold both in terms of what I can communicate, right? So a lot of it is the depersonalization from self and recognizing that it's not just about them. I think the other thing is just understanding that, like, everybody has a story, everybody has an experience. So even though I may not have had the same experience as my staff or as these external folks or whatever is happening, it doesn't absolve me from the responsibility of trying to understand right? So it's those types of hard discussions that I often have with clients to get them to recognize that they can go and stand up on that stage and say what they have to say.
It's interesting you mentioned responsibility, because I think, many companies today have done a lot of work to change how externally they portray their employees and who they are, and they take ownership of a lot of identities, a lot of indications of a certain amount of progress, and often that's not really reflected by how much those individuals are really seen and how much has changed internally.
Yeah, Robin, here's the thing though, right? Like, companies have done a lot, but people can sniff whether it's authentic or not. Okay, so you can put up all the programs and all the ads and do all the sponsorship and hire all the people who are diverse or whatnot, but if the leadership can't walk the talk and can't genuinely and authentically convey their message and what they feel, people are going to sniff right through it. And so I do think what I'm seeing is more leaders. I'll tell you, over the past 3 years, I've had more than, in my 20 years of coaching individuals, I have had literally more than ever leaders who actually raise their hand and come to coaching specifically because they want to understand for themselves, what the heck does it mean for me to lead with equity? I have now publicized to the world that equity is one of our core values, and I have no freaking idea what it means for me, right? And I'm not a diversity expert, even though people want me to be because of what I look like, right? But it becomes this like existential question about their own identity and power dynamics and all of that we have to completely unpack for themselves before they can authentically actually lead the organization through it. So it's a really interesting time around that. And a lot of kudos for those who have that self-recognition and come to the table and say, how am I expecting my people to lead with diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I don't even know what it means for me as a leader, as a CEO, as a CFO, or whoever it might be.
That touches on one of the questions from our community. And you are the author of Own the Room, Discover Your Signature Voice to Master Your Leadership Presence. And clearly a great resource for leadership, the characteristics of leadership. But are there any resources in addition to your own book that you might suggest that people could turn to in order for them to understand this increasingly complex world? And it may well not be a book, it may be the New York Times or your podcast. Leaders do have a huge amount they are now expected to understand. Where would you put your clients?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there are some great resources out there. I will tell you, I have a few tried and true resources that I think are helpful for anyone just from a pure management and leading standpoint. And I'll name what those are. And they're not new. And that's why I love them. They've been around and they're tried and true. So I think in terms of understanding, what does it take for me to get to the next level? What are some of the behaviors that I want to show? There's a great book called The Next Level by Scott Eblin, which really does a fantastic job of laying out at every stage in your career what you want to be thinking about. Similarly, a little bit more academic, but the book, The Leadership Pipeline by Ram Charan et al., there's other authors, is a great one. I think if you can get your hand on any of Herminia Ibarra's work, was a professor at HBS, then INSEAD, I'm not sure where she is now, but any of her work on power and influence, because of just this generational, so you can understand the generation above, that would be great. Pat Lencioni's work on team, so the 5 dysfunctions of a team, is, in my opinion, one of the best team books ever in terms of any type of team and how you work with a team. And then podcasts, I mean, there's so many. Even though my podcast is called Coaching Real Leaders, there's a podcast called Coaching for Leaders, which does a tremendous job on different leadership skills that I think is great listening for anyone. So those are just a few of them, and I could go on and on, but those are some good ones to think about. That
was really helpful and very generous of you. We appreciate it very much. I want to talk a bit about now, and as you were saying, understanding the generation, and obviously not all leaders are old guard. There are plenty of new companies that have emerged, but entering into a leadership team, and you mentioned CFO, CTO, there are a number of leadership roles that this talk is relevant to. How would you advise individuals to start their period as a leader?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is have a plan, right? Have an onboarding plan. I see so many leaders who start their new role, particularly as they've elevated up, and they actually don't have a plan of what that looks like. And actually that brings to mind one of my other favorite resources, which is Michael Watkins' The First 90 Days. Excellent. It's been out for many, many years, but an excellent resource on what do I need to be thinking about in those first 90 days, but it's really the first 12 to 18 months, right? And so what do you want to be thinking about? Number one, what are the expectations? What are you expected to be able to do in the short term? And what are you expected to be able to demonstrate in that first year, in that first year and a half, which I typically call, depending on the situation of the division that you're leading or the organization, the honeymoon phase, the learning phase. What are you supposed to learn? Who are the stakeholders that you need to be in touch with? Who do you need to be connecting with? What are your priorities going to be? And then getting alignment around all that. So there's, at the high level, you want to show some results pretty quickly, but you also want to understand what the long game is in terms of what you're going to have to be able to pull through. And then at a very tactical level, there, again, I see people lose sight of this. It's like, how do I have my cadence of meetings set up? How do I want to communicate? I just worked with a new CEO yesterday, and he's been in the role a couple of months, and we just laid out what are all the different types of communications he needs to have for the year, right? Who are the stakeholders? What's the communication, and for what purpose? So that's just systemized and put into a structure, and he doesn't have to think about it every single time. So having an onboarding plan is huge. The second is understanding that you are scaling up. You're doing everything at a different degree. And so what are the systems and structures that you have in place that will enable you to do that? And how do you then prioritize to make sure that you're adding value where you need to be adding value in this role, rather than defaulting to where you added value in your past role? If you don't have sight of that, or if you start feeling uncomfortable with that, absolutely guarantee you're going to default to what you did well in your previous role, and that's going to come at a huge detriment.
What is interesting, I think, often about leaders is that they really, as you mentioned, they can't really do much of the work themselves. It's so important to not only have fantastic relationships with other stakeholders and your peers and potentially a CEO above you in the C-suite, but also to really be able to engage and inspire teams to execute your vision and to incorporate their vision. How would you, I have heard, it is an often told tale of the new leader wanting to come in, wanting to drive immediate results, forcing things through, not, putting some noses out of joint, not really understanding some of the long-term view. How would you advise individuals to engage the teams that will ultimately be executing their strategies?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think especially now, given all the new dynamics that you articulated around sort of a change in behavior and expectations of leaders, you do want to drive results, but you can't do that without listening first. So I highly, highly advise new leaders to spend some time listening first, understanding what the context is, understanding from their teams, whether that's, the whole company or their small team. You've got to spend some time demonstrating, even if you already know, right? Because that's what I hear from people, but I already know. It doesn't matter. They don't know that you know. And the only way that you will engender confidence that you actually have the knowledge and understand what's happening is if you spend some time listening and asking the questions. So doing something like a listening tour, whether big or small, is really important. It's not just enough to listen, though. You want to be able to play back, here's what I heard, and then move to, based on what I heard, here are some of the things that I'm going to do, right? And that starts leading to then the plan, how you drive to results. What you want to be careful of, though, is spending too much time in the listening bucket, because at some point people are going to be like, okay, where's the action, right? Oh, you're still learning. We're like 8 months in, what's going on? What are you going to do? So there's a fine balance between the two, and you have to use some discernment and have some advisors who can help guide you around where's the tipping point where you want to transition to putting a plan in place and start communicating your vision, the plan moving forward.
We are coming to time, so please do ask any questions in the chat box if you would like us to try and have an answer. But I do have one more question. Thank you so much, Muriel, for your insight. It's been fascinating to hear. There is a distinction between being in the C-suite and being a leader and being the CEO or whomever may be the nominal figurehead of the company. And we've discussed a little bit about the pressure that takes in terms of the responsibility, but in terms of internally, clients of yours that are considering whether they want that top job, do you want to be responsible for a company? Well, how would you advise them to process that decision in and of themselves and to understand whether they're ready for it and if they want it enough?
So, the first thing to do is be a good study of who those folks are and what they're doing. Right. I mean, I remember when I was in a particular industry at one time and I was doing well, right? I had a very strong support. I was getting promoted really quickly, but I looked ahead and I realized that's not how I want to be. And that's not what I want to do. And most importantly, that's not how I want to make an impact, not in this sphere. So the first thing is look to determine what is it that might be your trajectory, and is that the trajectory that you want? Is it worth it to you, right? And then secondly, if it is, what is the best way for you to add value? What's going to be your secret sauce as you differentiate yourself as you go along that path? Because the path at some point doesn't become about just the skills of delivering. It really is about what differentiates you. It's no different than a sport. You know, not everybody gets to be the MVP player, right? Or the win Wimbledon. There's a differentiating aspect that happens over time. So you've got to be clear around what that is as well. And then the biggest thing is, you know, what I often advise people is stop thinking about so much about what's the position I want to get to, or what's the role I want to get to. Start thinking about it more in terms of what's the impact that you want to make, right? What is the impact that you want to make? And then peel back and say, okay, what type of role can I have that impact in? What type of industry, what type of company, with what type of people? And you might be surprised where it lands you. If you had asked me 30 years ago when I was in business school at Harvard Business School, that this is what I'd be an executive coach, I would have been like, heck no, right? But over time, what I realized is the impact I want to make is by helping leaders be not only effective in terms of delivering results, but be good humans in doing so. And I found that the best way I could do that right now, right, is by doing the work that I do versus, being a leader in one of those corporations where I could only have a singular impact. So think about impact, and be open to it changing over time. That's normal, and it should happen. If you're just so stuck on one way of doing things, it's going to close off the opportunities for you, right? So you want to be open about it as well.
That actually perfectly answered Delphina's question. So I will just ask one other question we had from our community, which is about, the opportunity to get more experience at a more senior role in smaller companies, or the opportunity to understand how the big companies really work. And I'm sure you hear it often.
Yeah. So two things in terms of getting opportunities, because again, the opportunities become narrower and narrower the more you want to advance or progress. So there's a couple of things. One is kind of goes back to an earlier question that you have around, development opportunities. So some of them are going to be handed to you. Okay. Great for you if they are, right? Harness those, take advantage of those. But what you also want to do is figure out where there might be opportunities that nobody even sees. I call it where are the gaps? And they tend to be, for lack of a better word, like the unsexy stuff, right? It's not the, hey, go throw us the best event ever. It's going to be, oh my gosh, we are incurring a lot of costs in this little area of the company that nobody pays attention to. But guess what? If I can figure out how to make that more efficient, it's going to help the bottom line for that leader who's actually critical to my career. So I'm going to going back to what we were talking about before, and pitch the idea. I'm going to surface the problem and then give the answer, right? So be mindful of where there are gaps. And even though they might not be attractive to you, it's not where you want to be spending a bunch of your time, you go do the work, but make sure you position it and get permission that somebody is vested in you doing this work. Okay, so find the gap and then cover the gap. I think the second thing is try to get a sponsor, or even better, ideally sponsors, plural. Mentors are great. Mentors give you advice. Sponsors advocate on your behalf. Okay, so can a mentor become a sponsor? Absolutely. But you have to make yourself sponsorable. So how do you do that? You deliver on results. You do all the things we talked about. And then you try to seek somebody out who has that line of sight to say, hey, look, help me, right? Help me advance. And you become their protege, all right? For better or for worse. But that, the research bears it out. And if you want to look at any of that research, follow Sylvia Ann Hewlett from HBS. She has tons of research on this, particularly for underrepresented groups. A sponsor makes a huge difference, both internally and externally, as you advance in your career. So don't lose sight of that. Don't think because you have a great LinkedIn, you have 5,000 people on LinkedIn and you have some mentors that you're covered. You've got to have sponsors, particularly when you're looking at advancement.
Once again, you perfectly answered one of the questions from Reiko, so thank you very much. I think we have time for just one more from Claudine, and that's talking about the specialization of qualifications. Certainly in the luxury industry, we have a couple of very, very well-respected specialized courses, but also a number that arguably are perhaps less compelling than their generalized peers in business schools. What do you think about industry specialized education?
So, you know, again, I think it depends on the industry that you're in. Obviously, in yours, you know, there's a calling for that. I do think, though, that while specialization will be helpful to you, particularly early on in your career, if you're looking to move into more managerial positions and leadership positions, you have to love that part of it just as much as you love the specialty, right? It's like the scientists who go work for a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, and all of a sudden, like, they do great in the lab, but now they're tapped to lead the whole research and development division. Well, you have to have just as much of a passion for being able to create these new health solutions as you do for everything that we talked about in terms of what's encompassed in leadership. You know, I call it, there's a difference between being a practitioner and running or managing or leading an organization. You know, I face that, right? Yes, I'm an executive coach, but I also run my firm. You know, it's a 25-person firm. I have to deal with clients. I have to go out and sell work. I have to love all those things equally, right? And if not, I'm always going to default, or I'm going to feel ultimately very frustrated that I don't get to just do the coaching. Now, is there anything wrong with leading as an expert? There's nothing wrong with it. Just choose. I see too many individuals who actually just want to be an expert leader, or quite frankly, just want to be an individual contributor, but they feel like they have to join the management ranks. You don't have to do anything. Just be very conscious about the trade-offs you're making. And at the end of the day, can you live with those trade-offs, right? That's it. You'll be a much happier human being, let me tell you, and you won't end up having to work with me.
I think it's also worth noting, you know, we face such huge problems now as a planet, as societies, as businesses, that, you know, many of the problems that leaders face are sort of above industry, or, you know, at a position, at a point where industries tend to connect, whether it's shifting consumer sentiment or the supply chain disruption.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Muriel, thank you so much for your time.
I
mean, find the gap is my new motto. Thank you so much for inspiring me. I'm sure you have inspired our community. This conversation will be available on YouTube immediately after we sign off. So please do go back and take notes if you need to. But otherwise, thank you so much, Muriel. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you all have a brilliant day. Thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.